Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last unit, I made the claim that there are three presidents which we consider part of the progressive era of presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And in that unit, we spent a little time getting to know Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, but we didn't quite get to Wilson. Wilson's going to be the main subject, in fact, of this unit. His presidency will span all of the videos and all of the days of instruction in this unit. He's in a lot of ways my least favorite president, although you don't have to agree with my opinion. You're welcome to form your own opinions. But I don't think anybody disagrees that his presidency is transformative, both at home and abroad. So, dear students, incline your ears and hear our stories, that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class today, you should be able to: 1. Describe Woodrow Wilson's background and his progressive reforms of his presidency. 2. Discuss the means by which women got the right to vote. And 3. Describe how Woodrow Wilson's missionary diplomacy ensured United States dominance in Latin America. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Woodrow Wilson had been a lawyer and a professor. He'd been, at one point, president of Princeton and the governor of New Jersey. He grew up as a Southerner during the Civil War and Reconstruction. He was the son of 3 generations of Presbyterian ministers and a product of a strict upbringing in what I think most people agree was a troubled era. Woodrow Wilson would, in a lot of ways, succeed in despite of this, but yet carry a lot of this baggage with him. Wilson's platform for campaigning for president was known as the New Freedoms, and he generally focused on 3 types of progressive era reforms. The first one was tariff reform. This came through the passage of the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913, which lowered the tariffs for the first time since 1857. It went against the protectionist lobby, who was saying that tariffs should be high to go protect American business. He also argued for business reform. This was established largely through the passage of the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. That established the FTC to go investigate and halt unfair and illegal business practices by issuing cease and desist orders, and also the use of the Clayton Antitrust Act, the successor to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Wilson established also the Federal Reserve System for his attempts at banking reform. The Federal Reserve System was a private banking system under federal control. The country under this Fed was divided into 12 districts with a central bank in each district. The Federal Reserve System would form the basis of today's modern banking system, and we still have the Federal Reserve Bank today, the product of the Wilson administration. Subpoint B. The Clayton Antitrust Act stopped companies from buying stock to form a monopoly. It ended injunctions against strikers unless they threatened irreparable damage. This was an act that was really important to union members, basically saying that the federal government wouldn't get involved in union strikes unless it was really, really important to get in there. Also to prevent the consolidation of businesses and the creation of monopolies and greater trusts. This act was referred to by Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor. He referred to it as the Magna Carta of Labor, a term that refers back to the English legal document of the Magna Carta, which eventually would give power to the people over the rights of the king. Woodrow Wilson started the Federal Trade Commission as well. Federal Trade Commission was a watchdog agency to investigate regulatory violations and to try to go end unfair business practices. The FTC exists today as a way of regulating businesses still to try to prevent the buildup of unfair monopolies. Subpoint C. Woodrow Wilson also took a page out of the Teddy Roosevelt book of The Bully Pulpit, and he set the precedent of giving the State of the Union message in person. Now, the Constitution of the United States requires the president to update Congress on the State of the Union from time to time. Because the president is the only person that all of America gets to vote on, he would represent the entire of the Union and from time to time would go praise Congress on how the country is doing. Now, since the time of Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson is kind of a famous introvert who hated giving public speeches, Thomas Jefferson says, State of the Union, I could write a letter. And he would just send off a letter to Congress about the State of the Union. Jefferson, used that model, and that persisted until Wilson. And Wilson said, no, I think we've given up our rights at the bully pulpit. And so instead he switched to an annual address where he would use the opportunity to call both houses of Congress together and to plead to them to go ratify things like the 16th Amendment, which would establish an income tax. That use of the bully pulpit would be one of the things that Woodrow Wilson would go back to again and again. And today's modern State of the Union address can go harken back here to the 1913 State of the Union that Woodrow Wilson used. Subpoint D. While Teddy Roosevelt was in a lot of ways an imperfect president on race, he did desegregate the federal government and appointed black people to serve in positions. For as progressive as Wilson was, though, on economic issues, he was no progressive by any measure on racial issues. His views on race were strongly shaped as growing up as a Virginian during the Civil War and during the time of Reconstruction. In 1915, a movie maker named D.W. Griffiths screened the first movie to be shown inside the White House. D.W. Griffiths was a famous movie man of the era, and the film was called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation was a fantastical retelling of how the Ku Klux Klan was founded during Reconstruction as a way of protecting white people from being mongrelized by infusions of African Americans. The Klan, in reality, had been crushed by President Grant in 1871. But after Birth of a Nation, it was revived, and it was, kind of got a new life into it. And in some parts of the country, the Ku Klux Klan became a major force for radical and religious bigotry. This was the movie that Woodrow Wilson chose to be the first one shown inside the White House. Wilson loved the film. He said it was like writing history with lightning. And he described it as, like some sources even claim that Woodrow Wilson said that Birth of a Nation should be required viewing in every American school. Woodrow Wilson also resegregated the federal government. He had, Roosevelt had desegregated it, but Wilson said, no, there's no place in here for black people, and resegregated the government. In 1914, a black man named William Monroe Trotter visited the White House to go argue for the expansion of Wilson's New Freedom Plan to African Americans, saying that African Americans need that same Wilsonian protection for their freedoms. Trotter was a black publisher. His newspaper was called The Guardian and was a strong proponent of racial equality. He had supported Woodrow Wilson in 1912 for his election, but when challenging Woodrow Wilson in 1914, Wilson had Trotter thrown out of the White House. Trotter was a co-founder of the Niagara movement. He helped found the National Equal Rights League. But his confrontational protests and hard stances sometimes put him at odds with others in the movement, particularly with groups such as the NAACP. William Monroe Trotter built an alliance with Roman Catholics to stop the screening of Birth of a Nation in 1921. That was a natural alliance because the Ku Klux Klan was also against Catholics. Roman numeral number 2. Here I want to pick up our storyline about women's right to vote and women's suffrage. Wilson had opposed women's suffrage. He was against it on the national level. He did support it on a state level, saying it was one of those things that states could do if they wanted to, but he offered no leadership on getting an amendment passed getting the women's right to vote. Though efforts had persisted for years to bring women's suffrage, by 1910, the reality was that women did have the right to vote in a handful of states, and even vote on national issues, vote on president, but only in a few states. That began to change, though, when college-educated women spread the suffrage message to the working class. Suffragists, now you'll sometimes hear them called suffragettes, but that's kind of an insulting term. Suffragists went door-to-door campaigning. They took trolley tours. They gave speeches at all the stops to go promote this issue of women's suffrage. Some even adopted the bold strategies of the British suffragists, like heckling public officials. In Great Britain, the women's suffrage movement went crazy with pipe bombs and incendiary devices and bricks thrown through the windows of members of parliament. And some of those tactics were picked up in the United States as well. Subpoint B, Susan B. Anthony's successor as head of the NAWSA, the National Association of Women's Suffrage, National American Women's Suffrage Association. Her successor was a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt. And Catt stressed organization, lobbying, and gracious ladylike behavior to go promote change. Catt basically would have said that the aggressive tactics like the British suffragists were using would have no place in NAWSA. The National Women's Party, though, took the other approach. They took a different tack, saying they pressuring for suffrage amendment. By 1917, a woman named Alice Paul was the head of the National Women's Party, and she pressured the federal government for a suffrage amendment with an around-the-clock picket line, which led to their arrest and force-feeding when the protesters attempted a hunger strike even to go draw their issues to national attention. Subpoint C, the decades of political influence and the steady work of women supporting the war effort eventually helped shame male politicians into extending the right to vote. Women were heading committees and selling Liberty bonds to go finance the war. They were knitting socks for soldiers, and it became pretty obvious that women contributing in the public sphere had in every way demonstrated that they could no longer be denied their right to vote. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment was enacted, and women won the right to vote. Some argue that women have always had the right to vote, just had it systematically denied to them, but the 19th Amendment secured that exercise of that right. Roman numeral number 3. Here I want to talk about Woodrow Wilson and the way that he approaches the rest of the world, because I think this is a really important way of understanding the rest of the Wilson presidency. Being the product of a strict religious upbringing, Woodrow Wilson wanted all aspects of his presidency to be driven by moral decisions. He's a man that always wants to be making the right decision, not just a good decision, and particularly the way that the United States would go deal with other countries. This was very different from the way that other presidents had dealt previous administrations who approached foreign policy with more practical concerns, like whether a particular policy decision would be in the United States' best interest. Woodrow Wilson wanted to make sure that it was not only in the United States' best interest, but it was just the best possible moral decision. Wilson considered democracy to be the best kind of government, and not just best in a political science sense, but the most moral form of government. And he would only engage other countries if they would promote democracy, or if that engagement itself would promote democracy. This became known as missionary diplomacy, and it was the effort to moralize the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had existed since the sixth president in American history, which said that the United States would not formally, fifth president in American history, which said the United States would not formally recognize any regimes that were oppressive or undemocratic. And so he basically takes the Monroe Doctrine, which was more or less saying that Europe had to stay on one side of the ocean and America would stay on the other. Wilson takes that Monroe Doctrine and moralizes it, saying the United States is only going to recognize countries that are democratic countries that respect their people. And if you're not democratic or you are oppressive, then the United States will refuse to recognize you as a legitimate country. Subpoint B, here's where the plot gets interesting. Mexico had been ruled over by a dictator named Porfirio Diaz. Diaz enjoyed a good relationship with the United States and had encouraged American investment in Mexico. The result was that Americans ended up owning a lot of Mexican oil wells and mines and railroads and ranches. They were in Mexico but owned by Americans. It made a few of the landholders of those areas very, very rich, but it left most people very, very poor. A typical economic situation in Mexico. In 1911, Mexican peasants and workers were led by Francisco Madero, and they overthrew Diaz. They overthrew Porfirio Diaz. Madero had promised all of these new democratic reforms, but sometimes promises are easier to make than they were to carry out, and they couldn't satisfy the landowners and the peasants and the factory workers and the middle class. After 2 years of what was really a failed government, Madero was murdered by a general of the army, Victoriano Huerta, and he took over the government. Wilson liked Wilson liked Madero, thinking that he might be an imperfect ruler, but his head was in the right place, but thought that Huerta looked like a military coup who was not in the right place, and Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's government. He called it a government of butchers. Wilson waited for Huerta's government to entangle itself in American affairs and then figured that that would be his moment to go step in. In 1914, Huerta's police arrested a small group of United States sailors in Tampico. Tampico is a port city, and sailors sometimes got mixed up in trouble and ended up getting themselves arrested. The sailors were quickly released once they said, "Oh no, you're American sailors and we don't want to go pick a fight with America." They released the sailors and they apologized. "Hey, I'm sorry we arrested your sailors," but it was enough of a reason that Wilson had been waiting for to go send in the United States Marines to go occupy the port city of Veracruz. 18 Americans and 200 Mexicans were killed in the invasion, and basically was just a way for the United States to go send an army into Huerta's government. The United States and Mexico nearly erupted into a full-on war, but Argentina, Brazil, and Chile stepped in to mediate and try to talk them down out of the battle. The South American countries suggested that maybe Huerta should resign, and the United States should maybe withdraw their troops and not pay for any damages and just let both sides walk away out of it. Huerta refused, and the United States refused to go acknowledge Huerta's legitimacy. The standoff, though, was pretty short-lived. Huerta's regime collapsed a few months later, and a new nationalist government was put into place. Woodrow Wilson withdrew his troops and recognized that brand new government. Subpoint C. Francisco Pancho Villa, we know him more as Pancho Villa. So Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata opposed this new nationalist government, though. This new nationalist government said, basically, Zapata and Pancho Villa said that it wasn't bringing out real land reform. It wasn't doing enough to actually help the peasant class. And they were ready to go fight for the government. Zapata has this great line where he says to his peasant followers, "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." Though Pancho Villa tried to get U.S. favor, Woodrow Wilson recognized that nationalist government. Then Pancho Villa threatened to attack the United States. And why would you recognize a government that doesn't respect its own people? And that's a war, that's war in the eyes of the Mexican people. When American miners were en route to go operate their mines in northern Mexico, Pancho Villa's men ambushed the train, they ripped Americans off of it, and then shot them. Then Pancho Villa's men got further into the United States, raiding Columbus and New Mexico, and killing 17 Americans there. So Wilson ordered the army to go put down these Pancho Villa raids, and Brigadier General John J. Pershing led a surge of 15,000 soldiers into Mexico to go capture Pancho Villa and to capture him dead or alive. And for nearly a year, Pershing's soldiers, 15,000 soldiers, searched through Mexico, kind of in vain, couldn't find him. Then Wilson added 150,000 National Guardsmen to be piped in along the United States-Mexico border. Meanwhile, in Mexico, they're looking at this and saying, like, we're growing angrier and angrier that the United States has 15,000 soldiers presence in our country, breaking into battles with the nationalist government. When Mexico demanded that the United States withdraw, America refused, and again, it nearly erupted into a full-on war. Both sides, though, stepped back from the conflict. It was as the Great War worsened in Europe. Essentially, World War I was stepping through Europe, and it became clear that maybe the United States and maybe Mexico would get tumbling into this. And the United States prepared to be dragged into the conflict. It seemed prudent to have peace on the southern border, and so Wilson basically capitulated on the fight and ordered Pershing home. Later that year, Mexico drew up a new constitution. That new constitution carried through on the promised land reforms, and it stripped American control of oil and mineral resources. It also restricted foreign investors, keeping American money out of Mexico on a large scale like that. Mexico eventually put down its own civil war and began reforms from there. The relationship between the United States and the rest of the world is about to blow open in a huge powder keg, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.